The Mexican government sent actual soldiers with bulldozers to destroy religious statues. 40 of them, gone in a single week. And it backfired so badly that the saint they tried to erase now has more followers than the entire population of Belgium. Her name is Santa Muerte, Holy Death. And she is, right now, one of the fastest growing religious movements on the planet, venerated by an estimated 10 to 12 million people across Mexico, Central America, and the United States. She's also been personally condemned by the Vatican, bulldozed by the Mexican army, and found more than once standing over a crime scene documented by the FBI. So here's the question this video is actually going to answer. How does one robed skeleton end up worshipped by drug cartel hitmen and terrified taxi drivers at the same time? And why did every single institution that tried to destroy her make her stronger? We want to thank you for supporting us. We're almost at 50 subs and it'd mean so much to me if you could support the channel by leaving a like and a sub to keep this channel going. Anyways, back to the video. The last week of March, 2009. Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas, on the Mexican side of the Texas border. Army trucks turn onto a service road lined with roadside shrines, glass cases, plaster figures, candles burned down to their last inch. Soldiers dismount. They are not here to arrest anyone. There is no one to arrest. They are here for the statues. One by one, the shrines come down. A skeletal figure in a wedding dress, toppled and cracked. A 7-foot Santa Muerte draped in gold-trimmed purple, pushed until the concrete base gives way. Bulldozer treads grind plaster and glass into the roadside dirt. Within days, soldiers will do the same in Tijuana. By the time the operation ends, close to 40 public shrines along the U.S. Mexico border will be gone. President Felipe Calderon has called her Mexico's religious enemy #1. His government believes that flattening her shrines will weaken the cartels who kneel before them. It will not work. Not even close. Within a decade, the saint the army tried to erase will have more followers than she has ever had, by some estimates, several times over. To understand why a government would send its army after a folk saint, and why the saint would win, you have to go back further than 2009. You have to go back to a name almost nobody in Mexico had heard before the year 2001, and further still, to a handful of yellowed pages in the archives of the Spanish Inquisition. Okay, I have to stop here for a second, because I think this is genuinely one of the wildest government decisions I've come across making these videos. You have a country in the middle of a brutal drug war, actual human lives being lost daily, and someone in government looked at that crisis and said, "You know what would help? Sending the army after statues. Not the guns. Not the money laundering. The statues." And it didn't just fail, it made things worse. That's the part one can't get past. We're going to come back to exactly how bad the backfire got, but keep that image in your head, an entire army division deployed against religious plaster figures. So who was this saint powerful enough to make a president send in the military? And more importantly, where did she actually come from? Because the popular answer you'll find online is almost certainly wrong. Here's the tension at the center of this story, and it does not resolve neatly. Santa Muerte has no earthly body, no verified miracles recognized by Rome, no canonization process, and no single founder. And yet by the mid-2010s, researchers estimated she had somewhere between 10 and 12 million devotees across Mexico, Central America, and the United States, a following that scholars of religion have called the fastest-growing new religious movement in the Americas. Most of those millions are not criminals. They are market vendors, nurses, mothers of migrants, long-haul truckers, and night shift workers who feel that the formal institutions around them, the church, the courts, the police, have already failed them once. But a minority of her devotees are cartel operatives. And that minority has generated a documented, FBI cataloged trail of shrines found beside bodies, altars found beside drug caches, and killings that investigators have linked, cautiously, and not always provably, to ritual devotion. Both things are true at once. That is what makes this story difficult, and why the Catholic Church, the Mexican state, and the FBI have all, in different ways, tried to answer the same question: is Santa Muerte a folk religion of the dispossessed, or is she a brand the worst people in Mexico have hijacked for themselves? The honest answer is that she is both, and neither side gets to have her exclusively. That answer is also, on its own, unsatisfying to the two institutions that have tried hardest to settle the question by force. Both the Roman Catholic Church and the Mexican state have, at different points, attempted to resolve the ambiguity by simply declaring her illegitimate, one on theological grounds, the other on security grounds. Both campaigns are matters of public record. Both, as this story will show, appear to have backfired. Here's where the story actually begins, and it does not begin where most people assume. Search her name online and a clean story appears. Santa Muerte, the legend goes, is the Aztec death goddess Mictecacicutl, driven underground by Spanish missionaries in the 1500s, who survived 5 centuries of persecution wearing a Catholic robe as a disguise. It is a powerful story. It gives her an unbroken, pre-conquest pedigree stretching back before Columbus. It is also not what the documentary record shows. Mictecacicutl was real. She and her husband Mictlantecutli ruled Mictlan, the Aztec underworld, and both were depicted as skeletal figures who oversaw rites for the dead that would later blend into Mexico's Day of the Dead. That much is settled anthropology. What is not settled, what historians who specialize in this subject openly dispute, is any documented line connecting Mictecacicutl to Santa Muerte. Here is the actual paper trail. The earliest confirmed written references to a folk figure called Santa Muerte come from Inquisition archives in the Mexican states of Querétaro and Guanajuato, dated to 1793 and 1797, nearly 200 years after Hernán Cortés and the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521. The documents describe Xiximec indigenous communities, not Mexica Aztecs, petitioning a skeletal figure of death for protection and justice. Clergy investigating the practice destroyed the effigies and prosecuted the worshippers for idolatry. Between those Inquisition reports and the next confirmed sighting of organized Santa Muerte devotion, there is close to a century and a half of near total silence in the historical record. That silence is the mystery at the heart of her origin story, and no scholar has fully closed it. Some historians have tried anyway, reaching for adjacent traditions to bridge the gap. Long before the Spanish arrived, the Aztec calendar had already devoted an entire month, roughly corresponding to August, to communal veneration of the dead, a tradition that colonial clergy, unable to eradicate it outright, compressed into 2 days and rescheduled to align with the Catholic feasts of All Saints and All Souls, November 1st and 2nd. Those 2 days survive today as Dia de los Muertos. It is tempting to draw a straight line from that pre-conquest calendar to Santa Muerte's later iconography, and popular retellings frequently do. Historians who specialize in the period urge caution instead. A shared cultural comfort with death imagery, they argue, is not the same as an unbroken religious lineage, and a gap of roughly 270 years between the fall of Tenochtitlan and the first written record of Santa Muerte is not a detail a documentary can responsibly paper over. Some researchers, including R. Andrew Chestnut of Virginia Commonwealth University, author of the first English-language academic study of the cult, argue that her skeletal imagery has less to do with Mictecacicutl than with medieval Spain. Spanish Catholicism arrived in Mexico carrying its own personification of death, La Parca, a robed, scythe-wielding reaper descended from European danse macabre imagery, the same iconographic tradition that gave the Grim Reaper his scythe in the first place. On this account, Santa Muerte is less an Aztec goddess in Catholic disguise and more a Spanish import that fused with indigenous reverence for the dead, syncretism, not survival. A smaller strand of research points somewhere else entirely, to a 17th century Ecuadorian penitent named Dona Sebastiana de Caso y Paredes, whose story of praying to death itself for deliverance from a forced marriage bears a striking resemblance to later Santa Muerte folklore. That theory remains a minority position, and most scholars treat it as speculative. What can be stated as documented fact is narrower, and in some ways more interesting than the legend. Santa Muerte worship went underground after the 1790s Inquisition crackdown, and stayed there. Anthropologists and journalists find no significant published reference to her between the early 1800s and the 1940s, when she resurfaces in scattered form, practiced quietly, and mostly by women performing love magic to keep unfaithful partners loyal. For most of the 20th century, she remained a private, clandestine devotion, whispered about, rarely photographed, invoked mostly by people whose professions put them in nightly danger: prostitutes, bartenders, mariachi musicians, and taxi drivers working the small hours. There is a reason that early clientele skewed so heavily toward people working the night shift of the informal economy. Death for a bartender closing up after 2 a.m., or a mariachi player walking home through unlit streets, or a woman selling sex on a corner with no one watching her back, was not an abstraction. It was a plausible outcome of an ordinary Tuesday. A saint who claimed no moral authority to judge how you earned your living, but who promised to walk beside you through the specific danger of your specific job, filled a need that the parish priest, however well-intentioned, was not positioned to fill. This is the part that genuinely surprised me doing the research, because I went in assuming the Aztec goddess story too. That's the version everyone repeats. But when you actually chase the paper trail, it just isn't there. There's a 270-year gap with basically nothing in it. And honestly, I respect that the real story doesn't need the ancient goddess dressing to be compelling. A folk devotion that quietly survived in the shadows for a century and a half, kept alive by people's society had already written off. That's a better story than a myth. Because it's true, and because it tells you exactly who she was always meant for. So how does a devotion that stayed hidden for 200 years suddenly explode into a 10 million person movement? It comes down to one woman, one sidewalk, and one very specific morning in Mexico City. October 31, 2001. Tepito, a dense, market-driven barrio in Mexico City long associated with contraband, boxing champions, and a code of loyalty stricter than the law that governs it. Enriqueta Romero, known to everyone simply as Dona Queta, steps outside her home and places a life-size statue of Santa Muerte in a glass case built into her front wall, facing the street. She is not inventing a religion. She has prayed to the bony lady privately for years, as have many of her neighbors quietly, the way earlier generations kept the devotion hidden from clergy and from each other. What Dona Queta does that October morning is different only in that she stops hiding it. Within weeks, dozens of people are stopping at her door to light candles. Within a few years, it is thousands, gathering each month for a rosary recited in her honor, most of them ordinary Catholics who also attend Mass, who also process past the Virgin of Guadalupe, but who have found in Santa Muerte something the official saints don't offer them, a figure who, in the words devotees themselves use, does not discriminate. That phrase recurs constantly in interviews with her followers, and it is the theological engine of the entire movement. Catholic saints come wrapped in moral expectation. Santa Muerte, as her devotees understand her, does not judge the sinner before granting the favor. Death, after all, comes for everyone, the faithful and the criminal alike, and so a saint who personifies death cannot logically discriminate between them either. This is folk Catholicism, not a rejection of Catholicism. The overwhelming majority of Santa Muerte's followers self-identify as Catholic. They cross themselves. They recite the Rosary, modified, with her invocations layered over traditional Catholic prayers. Their altars sit beside images of the Virgin Mary and Christ, not in place of them. Many devotees describe her not as a rival to the Church's saints but as one more intercessor in an already crowded spiritual household, a saint of last resort for the prayers that St. Jude, patron of lost causes, hasn't answered quickly enough. It's worth pausing on why that appeal lands so hard in Mexico specifically. In a country where roughly half the population has historically lived with limited access to the formal justice system, and where institutional trust in police and courts runs low, a saint who promises fast, unconditional results, for a job, for a cured illness, for a missing person found, offers something concrete that bureaucratic religion and bureaucratic government both struggle to deliver on the same timeline. The devotional system that grew up around her is elaborate, and it is almost entirely borrowed from Catholic practice. Votive candles come color-coded to specific requests: red for matters of love, gold or amber for money and prosperity, purple for healing, black for protection, and, more darkly, for harm against an enemy. Researchers who have interviewed devotees at length hear the same kind of testimony again and again. A young lawyer named Rodrigo told Chestnut he came to the Tepito shrine to give thanks for surviving a kidnapping. An accountant named Claudia credited a Santa Muerte statuette, given to her by her own surgeon before a lung operation, with her recovery. A Mexico City street vendor put the appeal more bluntly, describing the saint as a cabrona, a tough, take-no-nonsense woman, in a way she said she would never use to describe the Virgin of Guadalupe. That distinction matters. Devotees are not choosing Santa Muerte instead of Mexico's official patroness. They are choosing her in addition, for a different register of problem, the ones where politeness hasn't worked. Dona Queta's Tepito shrine becomes the movement's unofficial capital. It also becomes, without her especially seeking it, the epicenter of a controversy that will eventually reach the Vatican itself. And her following did not stay confined to Mexico City. By the mid-2000s, Mexican and Central American migrants were carrying her devotion north across the border, establishing altars in cities with large Mexican-American populations: Los Angeles, Houston, Chicago, New York. In Queens, a devotee named Arely Vasquez Gonzalez built a private shrine in her apartment and hosted an annual August celebration, complete with a mariachi band, for the saint she called her queen. By the early 2010s, researchers were documenting Santa Muerte statuettes and votive candles for sale in religious goods shops across the American Southwest. In some stores, Chestnut found devotional merchandise tied to her accounted for nearly half of total sales. Because as her following exploded through the 2000s, on both sides of the border, so did the number of raids, court cases, and crime scenes in which police found her image standing over the evidence. And two of Mexico's most powerful institutions, the Roman Catholic Church and the Mexican state, concluded, within a few years of each other, that this growth had to be stopped. I think what gets me about Dona Queta's story is how small the actual moment was. She didn't hold a press conference. She didn't launch a campaign. She just stopped hiding a statue that was already in her house. That's it. That's the entire spark that eventually got the attention of the Vatican and the Mexican army. And if you think about it, that says a lot about how much pent-up demand there already was. She didn't create the following. She just gave millions of people permission to stop being quiet about something they already believed. One woman's front porch turned into a 10 million person movement in less than a decade. But here's where it gets complicated. Because that same decade is exactly when Mexico's drug war exploded, and the two stories were about to become impossible to separate. To understand the Vatican's eventual condemnation of Santa Muerte, you first have to understand what else was happening in Mexico during the years her public following was exploding. In December 2006, newly inaugurated President Felipe Calderón declared war on the country's drug cartels, deploying the military into cartel-controlled territory in a strategy that would, over the following years, coincide with a homicide rate that climbed into the tens of thousands annually. Santa Muerte devotion did not cause that war. But her public profile rose in near lockstep with it, and in the media coverage that followed, the two stories fused into one: skeleton saint, drug war, narco culture, all folded into a single, simplified narrative. By 2009, that narrative had reached the presidency itself. Calderón's government formally branded Santa Muerte an enemy of the Mexican state and ordered the shrine demolitions along the border, the operation this story opened with. Officials framed it as a psychological blow against cartel morale, on the theory that traffickers who built roadside altars for protection would be destabilized by watching them bulldozed. The Catholic Church had its own, older objection, theological rather than tactical, and it had been building for years before Calderón ever sent in the army. Mexican bishops had condemned Santa Muerte devotion repeatedly through the 2000s, calling it idolatry and warning parishioners away from Day of the Dead celebrations that incorporated her imagery. But the condemnation that made international headlines came from Rome itself. In the spring of 2013, Cardinal Gianfranco Ravasi, then president of the Vatican's Pontifical Council for Culture, used a multi-day visit to Mexico to deliver a direct verdict. He called devotion to Santa Muerte sinister and infernal. He said it did not qualify as religion simply because it was dressed up to resemble one. It was, in his words, a blasphemy against religion itself. The theological logic behind that statement matters, because it is more specific than it first sounds. Christianity's central claim is that Christ defeated death through the resurrection. To Ravasi and the Mexican bishops who echoed him, venerating a figure who personifies death, rather than a figure who conquered it, puts the worshipper in league with Christianity's defeated enemy. Religion celebrates life, Ravasi said. Here you have death. The timing of the Vatican's intervention was not incidental. Weeks earlier, the College of Cardinals had elected Jorge Mario Bergoglio, Pope Francis, the first Latin American pope in the Church's history, and Ravasi's condemnation arrived as part of a broader Vatican reassertion of authority over folk religious movements across Latin America, movements the institutional Church had spent decades watching migrate outside its control. Francis, an Argentine, would have grown up aware of San La Muerte, Santa Muerte's male counterpart venerated in northeastern Argentina. Himself a folk saint the Argentine Church had already rejected as heretical. Here's the irony the Vatican's own statement can't quite escape. Most Santa Muerte devotees do not experience their devotion as a break from Catholicism at all. They see it as an extension of it, proof, if anything, of how completely Catholic vocabulary, ritual, and iconography has been absorbed into a practice the Church itself refuses to claim. Rome rejected a saint that millions of self-described Catholics insist belongs to their own faith. The Vatican's opposition did not end with Ravasi's 2013 remarks. Mexican bishops continued the campaign in the years after, with the Archdiocese of Mexico City stating flatly that Santa Muerte veneration stood in direct opposition to Church teaching, and individual archbishops warning that continued devotion, for a practicing Catholic, amounted to leaving the faith in everything but name. Some Mexican exorcists went further still, linking Santa Muerte practice to what they described as a rise in demand for exorcisms nationally, framing devotion to her as a gateway to demonic influence rather than a variant of legitimate folk piety. Pope Francis himself, during a 2016 visit to Mexico, praised what he called the treasures of the country's popular religiosity in the same breath as he criticized those who, in his words, commercialize death in exchange for money, a rebuke aimed squarely, though not by name, at the saint his own countrymen's church had already rejected in Argentina. That rejection did not shrink her following. If anything, it handed her devotees a persecution narrative that made the movement more coherent, not less. I want to be really careful and respectful here, because this touches real religious belief on both sides. The Church's position comes from a genuine, coherent theology, not just PR. But I'll say this much, from a pure communication standpoint, having the Vatican publicly call your saint sinister and infernal is the kind of headline you could not buy with a marketing budget. I'm not saying that's why it grew. I'm saying institutions with centuries of experience keep making the same miscalculation with movements like this. They treat condemnation like a deterrent, when for a devotion built around she accepts everyone the Church rejected, condemnation just proves the point. Micro hook. But the Vatican's objection was theological. The Mexican government's objection was about something far more physical, and far bloodier. Because this is the part of the story where Santa Muerte actually did show up at crime scenes. Real ones. Documented by the FBI. No single cartel invented Santa Muerte devotion, and no single cartel owns her. That distinction matters, because popular retellings of this story often collapse it into a cleaner narrative than the evidence supports, as if one organization built her into an official house religion. The documented reality is messier and, in some ways, more unsettling. Devotion to Santa Muerte spread organically through the trafficking world the same way it spread everywhere else, adopted individually by smugglers, hitmen, and traffickers across rival organizations who were otherwise trying to kill each other. The Sinaloa Cartel, co-founded in the 1980s by Joaquin El Chapo Guzman and Ismael El Mayo Zambada, and by the 2010s the most dominant trafficking organization in Mexico, responsible according to U.S. prosecutors for smuggling multi-ton quantities of cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl into American cities, is one of several major cartels whose lower and mid-level operatives have been documented venerating her, largely as a personal protector for the specific hazards of the trade: safe passage across the border, protection from rival gunmen, safe arrival of a shipment. Santa Muerte's black candle, associated in her color-coded devotional system with vengeance and protection from harm, holds particular significance in trafficking circles, where the difference between a safe delivery and a shallow grave can come down to a single checkpoint. It is worth being precise here, because loose language does real damage to this story. Describing Santa Muerte as something the Sinaloa Cartel turned into a brand overstates what the documented record actually shows. There is no indictment, no seized ledger, no cooperating witness testimony establishing that Sinaloa Cartel leadership, Guzman, Zambada, or the faction leaders who succeeded them after their 2016 and 2024 arrests, ever issued anything resembling an official theology. What exists instead is a pattern repeated across the broader narco-cultura that surrounds Mexican trafficking organizations generally, a shared visual language of skulls, sides, and skeletal saints that shows up on tattoos, in narco-corrido lyrics, on custom vehicle paint jobs, and in home shrines, adopted by individual traffickers the same way soldiers throughout history have adopted personal talismans. Not handed down by command, but circulating peer-to-peer through a culture that has normalized her as a protector figure for people who live one arrest or one bullet away from disaster. The deepest, most documented cartel association with her darker applications actually belongs to a different pair of organizations, the Gulf Cartel and its former armed wing, Los Zetas, along with La Familia Michoacana, groups that built her into an explicit, almost liturgical part of their operational violence during the late 2000s, at the height of Calderon's war. Los Zetas began as an enforcement wing recruited from former Mexican Special Forces soldiers by Gulf Cartel leader Ojel Cardenas Guillen in the late 1990s, before splitting into a cartel of its own and building a reputation for exceptional and deliberately public brutality. Violence used not just to eliminate rivals but to broadcast a message. La Familia Michoacana, led during this period by Nazario Moreno Gonzalez, known as El Cheo, fused trafficking with an invented pseudo-religious ideology of its own. Organizations already building violence into a kind of theater were the ones most likely to fold Santa Muerte's imagery into that theater, not as official doctrine, but as a symbolic language their members already spoke fluently. The Sinaloa Cartel's own recent history underscores how far the organization's problems now run past image and iconography. In July 2024, U.S. authorities arrested both Zambada and Joaquin Guzman Lopez, one of El Chapo's sons, in El Paso, a stunning end to Zambada's 4-decade run as one of the only old guard capos never previously arrested or incarcerated. He pleaded guilty in August 2025 to racketeering conspiracy and running a continuing criminal enterprise. In February 2025, the U.S. State Department formally designated the Sinaloa Cartel a foreign terrorist organization. Creator take. This is exactly the kind of nuance that gets flattened every single time this story gets told online, and it genuinely bothers me. It's so much easier to say, the cartel made her their brand. It's a cleaner headline, it fits in a title card. But the real story is scarier in a different way. It's not one organization with a marketing plan, it's a symbol that spread person to person through an entire violent subculture, the same way slang or tattoos spread, with nobody controlling it, and nobody able to stop it. That's a much harder problem to solve than arrest the guy who invented it. Because there is no guy who invented it. Here is the resolution to the tension this story opened with, and it is not the resolution either the Vatican or the Calderon government was hoping for. Santa Muerte was never only a criminal phenomenon, and never only a devotion of the innocent poor. She was always both, built on one radically simple premise. Death does not discriminate, so either does the saint who personifies it. That is exactly what makes her useful to a trafficker, meaningful to a sex worker praying for safety, and threatening to any institution whose authority depends on sorting the worthy from the unworthy. The Vatican couldn't excommunicate her. She was never inside the church. The state couldn't arrest her. She has no body to detain. All they could destroy were statues and a name, and both discovered that a saint built on death coming for everyone is remarkably hard to kill. The cartels didn't build her following. The desperate did, long before any trafficker claimed her. Condemnation just proved her point, that the official world had, once again, decided who belonged. To millions who kneel before her today, that was never an argument against her. It was the whole point. If there's one thing I want you to walk away from this video with, it's this: the loudest headline about a movement is almost never the whole truth of it. Yes, there are real, documented, disturbing cases where this imagery was used to justify horrific violence. I'm not glossing over that, and I don't think anyone should. But the millions of people quietly lighting a candle for a safer commute, a sick relative, a missing child, deserve to be part of this story too. Respect for people's faith, even faith an institution has officially rejected, costs us nothing, and I think it's worth remembering that the next time a headline tries to hand you the simple version of a complicated story. So here's what I want to know from you. If an institution as powerful as the Vatican or an entire national army can't kill a belief by condemning it or bulldozing it, what actually could? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and let me know where in the world you're watching this from.